Okay, this is my second recorded interview on for Organic News on Awake Radio. Today's Tuesday, February the 9th. They're changing servers at Awake Radio, so this recorded interview will be played at a predetermined time that I will let people know. And so I have with me next from Detroiters Resisting Emergency Management, Michael Doan. So thank you for joining me, Michael.
Thank you, Kat. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm really glad to be talking with you and your listeners.
I learned about Detroiters Resisting Emergency Management when Thomas Stephen, I'm not sure.
Stevens.
Yeah, Stephen was on Democracy Now! Last week, and really, I guess I'm just going to kind of go to the punchline, and he brought out the possibility that Governor Snyder was involved in the privatization of the water supply in order to seek some profit. I mean, he wasn't accusing, but he said if it's found out, if it comes out that he is involved in it in any kind of way, there goes his career. But any chance of Governor Snyder going to jail, being arrested?
Well, that's a really good question. I think it's a question on a lot of people's minds right now. We know now that there's actually an FBI probe that's being done into Snyder's involvement in the Flint water crisis, as among other people. So yeah, I think that a few months ago when a lot of people from across the state were starting to call for Snyder's arrest in connection to the Flint water crisis, I might have given you a different answer, but increasingly it does seem as though there is that possibility. I heard some talk today about the possibility of involuntary manslaughter charges, or at least that's one thing that at least some folks are considering. But regardless of what happens in the courts, there have also been, I guess it was about over a year ago now, people in Flint began calling for a People's Water Tribunal. So that would be like a tribunal organized by people in Flint and in Detroit that would be bringing people together to, regardless of what the state government or the federal government decides to do about investigating particular crimes and whatnot. The people of Michigan do have their own views on what has been going on. And just recently, in fact, I believe it was the 23rd of January, we ended up having a People's Tribunal on Water Crimes right in Detroit at the Cass Corridor Commons. And a group of elder activists and organizers sat on the jury, and they listened to witness testimony from people who have been living in Detroit and in Flint and living through the ongoing water crises in both cities, and just talking about their experiences and how their lives were totally disregarded by these people in power, emergency managers, all the way up to Governor Snyder, current mayor of Detroit. So yes, long story short, yes, I think that this is a question that people have been asking for a long time, and a question that has been answered by the people of Detroit and Flint in some ways, and that is also connected to what's now a federal investigation.
And they did the same thing actually after the COP21 in Paris. They held like a People's Tribunal. Bill McKibben from 350.org, Naomi Klein from
Yeah.
this changes everything. And it was this one actor guy was there. I'm sorry, like I could see his face, but his name is escaping me. And they held like, like not such a mock trial. It was actually, a real trial where people got to speak, people whose environments, people from the Marshall Islands. This one woman from the Bayou, down in Louisiana,
Right.
whatever. I mean, that exactly. I mean, and this is kind
Yeah.
of.
I mean,
Go
I
ahead.
mean, I liked your point there, right? I mean, that a people's tribunal. I mean, it's other than and more than just a mock trial, right? Because you have people testifying about their actual experiences, their lives, right? So, we had one woman from Flint who was talking about just the specific ways that she has suffered because of lead poisoning, and how she's in the past months has been having grand mal seizures, and has been unable to bathe, forced to make decisions between, am I going to use the water that I've been able to get from, going down to the fire station, visiting the National Guard? Am I going to use that one case of bottled water today to, wash my hair, or am I going to use it to make some spaghetti? Am I going to eat? Am I going to drink? So all the choices that she's just facing on a day-to-day basis. And so, yeah, I mean, this is not by any means just like a joke. This is real. This is people's lives that they're talking about, and it was a cathartic experience. I heard from people who participated to actually share that stuff and to express outrage over what's been done.
I mean, I've been calling for a revolution for quite some time now, and I really hope that we get to a point real soon, because again, I'm just going to refer to my previous interview with Jay Parker. I mean, the people in power, I mean, they have a lot of power, and guess what they're doing with it? They're not looking out for us. It's actually the opposite, and we better wake up to that. I mean, people are waking up to it, but I mean, I really pray that it's within a sufficient amount of time, because people have died of Legionnaire's disease from the
That's
water.
right.
So,
And Flint, yeah. I mean, I've heard of. I think it's 9 or 10 cases of people who have actually died, and in dozens and dozens more cases reported.
and so why does Governor Snyder get asked to step down? I mean, they don't ask the average person if they want to get arrested and go to jail. I mean, why can't they just arrest this guy?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, and
Yeah, I mean,
I,
it shouldn't be
I,
so hard to just arrest him.
yeah. Well, I think that it's important. I think that it's important that people are, holding people like Governor Snyder responsible for their roles in all of this. But on the other hand, I think it's also important for us to take a step back and think about what's going on now, in historical context in Michigan. So I mean, it's true that there have been a lot of, you know not just bad or foolish decisions, but reckless decisions being made by a lot of people who are charged with the care and protection of the people of Michigan in recent times. But if we try to understand what's going on now in broader historical perspective, then we're reminded that, I mean, look, these places that are experiencing these tremendous and just outrageous water crises right now, are both cities that decades ago were pretty, or by and large, prosperous hubs, auto manufacturing hubs, right? And so how did we get there from a place where there was, fairly high levels of employment, where there was, a solid population base and tax base to support infrastructure, including water and sewage infrastructure, that sort of thing. How do we get from there to where we are now? Well, you have a lot of things that are common themes in Flint and Detroit, right? So, starting in the 50s and 60s, you had a process known as suburbanization in both cities, where you had factories as well as people, mostly white people, moving out of the city into the suburbs to work and to live. You had, and this was all supported by the federal government with building, freeways and housing programs that encourage people to buy homes in the suburbs and that sort of thing. So you had people, this massive flight out of cities, and that's the flight of, again, mostly white folks leaving cities. Your population base is deteriorating, your tax base is deteriorating, and at the same time, all the jobs, because the factories are leaving these cities. And increasingly, what you had is a lot of people, largely people of color, right, living in predominantly black cities, who have been pushed out of waged employment. At least large populations of people. So you have, upwards of 40%, probably more in Detroit, living in poverty, and unemployment rates between 15 and 20%. A lot of people who have never been even involved in formal labor markets. So the background of all this, just to bring this all together, is that you have cities that are just ravaged by intense poverty. And in that context, you then have the Michigan government under Rick Snyder implementing this emergency manager law, which effectively allows him to appoint emergency managers that come into cities and take total control over everything in those cities. They could literally push the local elected officials out of power. And some people might not appreciate this, but in Michigan, 75% of black elected officials at the local level have been pushed out of power under the emergency manager law. And that's over 50% of African Americans in the state who are now living in cities that have, in effect, no local control over what's going on. Now that's just staggering. And it's in that context that you then have these crises that are created in large part by people making decisions that only take into account the bottom line. It's sometimes said that emergency managers in Michigan, they can do everything except miss a bond payment.
Okay, I'm trying to just find, because I wrote a blog about it, and I was writing like so many of the comments that Tom Stevens from the National Lawyers Guild and also from your organization, Detroiters Resisting Emergency Management, when he was on Democracy Now! Last week. I think it was last Wednesday. He was really good, and he was saying something about like somebody, was it the emergency management that actually had the power to like override contracts?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Override contracts, collective bargaining agreements. You name it. They're just basically complete control over the finances and governance of the city.
Yeah, he said the privatization of water. A state where this governor instituted the emergency management policy, which is like privatization on steroids. Total privatization of governments. Southeastern Michigan has 2 water authorities. The Caringnandi Water Authority, digging a pipe to Lake Huron, and the Great Lakes Water Authority is taking over older infrastructure of the Detroit Sewage Department. While the authorities are being created, you have poisoning of the water of the poor people of color and mass water shutoffs in violation of the human right to water and sanitation in Detroit. I was trying to find the where he talked about and he went on to talk about the like why did they do it, because there was no economic reason for them to do it.
Uh-huh.
I found the okay, I'm just going to read this one sentence. This is what was done to save money, or was it something else? Flint and Detroit were under state-appointed emergency managers accountable only to the governor and empowered, right, to override contracts and laws.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's, people overriding laws. It's like, who died and left them like, creator of the universe? I mean, these people are really
Right.
out of their minds.
Well, and by design, right? They're totally unaccountable to the people over whom they're exercising authority, right? So when you have an emergency manager that comes into a city, basically usurping the local elected governance. The mayor, the city council, I mean, everyone who's been elected by the people who actually live in those places is just pushed aside. And the emergency managers don't have to answer ultimately to the people in the places that are living there, right? I mean, they answer to the person who appointed them, which is Governor Snyder. And so that's why, I mean, this is really important for people to understand. I mean, this is one of the big reasons why so much attention has been directed back towards Snyder, is that in both of these cities that have in some ways very different, but also importantly connected water crises, right? So you have people in Detroit who are facing, we've had in the past 2 years, 91,000 households have had their water cut off. And then in Flint, you have people who are paying for and are being, forced to pay for water that they can't drink.
Right.
So you have people in Detroit going without water, right? And people in Flint who are forced to pay for water that they can't drink, and then on top of that, pay for bottled water or whatever else that they need to survive.
How is it that they have to pay for this poisoned water? And are they? I mean, I hope the people are just telling the city to where to stick it.
Well, yeah, I mean that's a question on a lot of people's minds, right? I mean, why would you be able to, or why would you be forced to pay for what's basically poisoning, you and your children and elders living in your home, and also, I mean, a lot of people have recently been recognizing that in Flint, inmates in the local jail have been forced to drink this water for a long time. While you would have guards who were drinking other stuff, but inmates were not receiving due notice about the health risks of the water. We're now hearing reports too of police in Flint going to visit, going door to door, ostensibly to hook people up with water or have water be delivered to them, but they're serving warrants while they're doing it. So you have, imagine coming to the door to get some,
right,
where you think you're getting water, right, and what you're really doing is getting arrested,
right,
to then be sent to jail to drink poison water in jail, to bathe in it, to eat food that's been made with poison water. I mean, it's just it's outrageous.
So I just wanted to read again. This was what Thomas Stevens said on Democracy Now! From the perspective of emergency management, which is supposed to be about fiscal integrity of municipalities, it makes no sense to start a new authority and deprive the existing system of revenue. So the question is, why did they do it? It most certainly comes down to the political and economic power that local officials get. If you can build a system like this, then you control development and I think I left out the word. And if somebody owns a lot of property and wants to develop and make a lot of money by creating residential suburb or selling the property, they need water and drainage. So if you have control over that in your area, you have an immense source of power and money, and I think that's what's behind it. If Governor Snyder is tied to that, that will be the end of his career.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, if they're looking into that. I mean, do they care?
Well, I think these are huge and very important questions, right? So why? I mean, we keep hearing that that in Flint that the decision to switch off of the clean Detroit water that Flint was getting and to the Flint River, and that decision was apparently, we're told, about saving money, and that so was the longer term decision to switch to the Carignan Water Authority. But I think that, right, I think that Tom is raising some important questions there, right? Who actually stands to benefit economically from the creation of this new authority, and in terms of political power, right? I mean, water is a basic necessity of life, and as you just pointed out, the infrastructure that's connected to the delivery of water services is incredibly important, and having control over that does give you control over decisions that have to do with development. So, where are houses going to be built? Who's going to live in those houses, right? What kind of housing and other construction projects are going to happen, and where? I mean, those are all decisions that have to be coordinated with whoever controls water infrastructure. So yeah, I mean, we people have to ask questions and follow the money here, and we need to look at who stands to benefit from the creation of these huge authorities. In Detroit, I mean, you have the Detroit Water and Sewage Department has been for years something that was under the auspices or governed by the city of Detroit. And now with the creation of the Great Lakes Water Authority, you have this collection of mostly suburban power brokers who now, when they didn't previously, have control over the way that the water department is run and how services are delivered, where infrastructure repairs are happening, how rates are being structured, and so on and so forth. So it's important to understand what's going on here as in part a shift in who has control over these, infrastructures and services that are providing basic necessities of life and things that are, human rights that need to be protected.
I mean, so much in our country and world, has been corporatized, and I mean, literally everything is for profit. So things like water, I mean, decency. I mean, even the justice system, like everything is literally for sale.
That's right. And one of the reasons people are particularly concerned about these water authorities, these regional water authorities that are popping up in Michigan now, right, and that are only popping up that have been made possible by these emergency manager laws, right, mind you, that there wouldn't be the creation of these authorities if you didn't have emergency managers operating in Flint and Detroit. One of the reasons that people are so concerned about this is that we've seen this elsewhere in the world, where these regional authorities are essentially become stepping stones for movements toward privatization. So in Detroit, for example, when Kevin Orr, the emergency manager, was in control of the city, who was he consulting with about the creation of the Great Lakes Water Authority? Well, none other than Veolia, which is one of the largest, right, corporations, private corporations that that bottles water around the world.
Oh wow.
So you had Orr consulting with Veolia and very openly, this is not a secret, openly discussing the possibility of privatizing the Detroit Water and Sewage Department. Now that didn't happen, and instead, when Orr left his office as emergency manager, and when Mayor Mike Duggan took back over in Detroit, Duggan promised that he wouldn't privatize the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, but instead, what we've gotten is the creation of this Great Lakes Water Authority, which again, there's still concerns that can be a gateway towards privatization.
So that situation that went on in Detroit is now kind of spread to Flint.
Well, I mean, I'm not as familiar with the details of the Caragnandi Water Authority, which is the water authority that was created or that's being created in Flint and the surrounding region. But definitely the creation of both it's not just a mere coincidence, right? That you have in both places state-appointed emergency managers who are at least considering directly privatizing the water systems, and that eventually, instead of directly going in that direction, end up making it possible to create these regional water authorities that change the way the water infrastructure and the water departments are governed, and it takes control away from the predominantly black communities and communities of color, where these where the water departments were originally created and funded and governed.
They never asked Governor Snyder to testify. Why is that? Or is that kind of an obvious question?
So I heard. I don't know about the details of this, but I've heard that Snyder was invited to participate in a congressional hearing, and that so was Darnell Early, who was the emergency manager in Flint, and who later became the emergency manager in control of Detroit Public Schools, but has since stepped down. So I've heard that they were both invited to testify before or as part of a congressional hearing. But my understanding is that Snyder declined, that it was that was a voluntary sort of thing, that he was not forced to participate, and that he declined.
But wasn't the other guy? Is it Daryl or Darnell Early?
Darnell or
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I wrote Daryl. He actually was subpoenaed to testify and didn't show up.
Okay. Well. I what can I say, Kat? I'm not surprised. These are people who would probably be wanting to avoid being under the spotlight as much as possible.
I mean, when you're subpoenaed to testify in court, don't you have to go?
Well, yeah, one would think, right?
And then if you don't go, they would kind of, come after you.
Yeah, well, I mean, for most of us, right? So it's interesting to think about why there's some people who just feel like that they can avoid these accountability measures and these legal accountability measures with such impunity, right? What is it that entitles people to actually avoid those kinds of possible penalties and that sort of thing?
And he could, though. I mean, he did it, and he didn't get. There were no consequences for him doing it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be interesting to follow that and see what comes of it. But yeah, interesting.
So what are the people doing? Let me just go to your so the Detroiters Resisting Emergency Management website. It's what's wrong with emergency management? It's unconstitutional. Emergency managers, EM function as dictators, and just reading that first sentence made me think of John Perkins, who wrote Confessions of an Economic Hitman. They call economic hitman, they just call it EHM. And so now this is just EMs. So emergency managers then are, yeah, they're managing emergencies. They're creating emergencies.
Right. I mean that's such an important thing to be thinking about, right?
They always call things one thing, and then the reality is always something else. To throw people off, they call it emergency management. When it's emergency creator.
Right. Send in to manage the emergency, and then make a new one. Yeah, and with all those powers that folks are given in those emergency manager roles, under the guise of balancing the books, folks who are appointed in those positions have a lot of leeway to get a lot done that probably otherwise, people wouldn't stand for, right? If they were actually accountable to the people over whom they had that sort of power. So it's really, this is serious stuff, and that's why in Detroit in particular, but other places as well, so many people have when these laws were enacted, the emergency manager laws come together. So Detroiters Resisting Emergency Management, or DREM, is actually a coalition of organizations in Detroit, and there's too many to name really, but who came together to protest the laws that were enacted by the governor allowing emergency management to take place, and also to highlight the fact that it's not an accident that emergency managers are being appointed all over the state in predominantly black cities. Right? So you have Flint, Pontiac, Benton Harbor. As I was saying before, 75% of African American elected officials in Michigan have been pushed out of office under these emergency manager laws. So
it's the first number one, it says that the emergency manager is right. They can write up new laws, sell city or property, cancel labor contracts, overrule all elected leaders, including city council and the mayor. This law was passed against the will of the people in a sneaky fashion, signed into law the day after Christmas. I mean, it's just in your face, like blatant criminality. I mean, people are supposed to be working together. Like, that's what I mean. Like, everything is supposed to be, like, for the people and what's good for the people. And it's just in your face that it's at the expense of.
Right. No, absolutely. And I mean, the good thing is that people really have been coming together. In response to these just tremendous crises in Detroit and Flint, in Detroit, for example, when as I was saying before, 91,000 households having their water shut off. I mean, just think about the number of people who are affected by that. Whole neighborhoods, right? Whole blocks having their water shut off, and we're not just talking about able-bodied adults and that sort of thing. We're talking about children who are having water shut off, elders, disabled folks in their home, people who need to dress wounds and do other things that they need water for, take medication. I mean, think about all the things that all of us need water for every single day: brushing our teeth, cooking food, right, flushing the toilet, and just it can be difficult to imagine the kind of crisis situation that is created when a whole block, or multiple blocks, have their water shut off. But what we've been seeing is people coming together and creating alternative water systems, both to cope with the situation, and to survive in the midst of all of this. So people in Detroit, stringing hoses into each other's homes to make sure that people at least have some water, and collecting rainwater, using water catchment systems, and finding ways to clean that water so that it can be used, and also setting up people's water stations, right? So, there have been all kinds of people working on the ground, both in and out of organizations. But it's worth mentioning some of the organizations that have been involved. So folks with the People's Water Board Coalition, with We the People of Detroit. Certainly, folks with We the People of Detroit have been, on the ground for years now, delivering water to people's homes, managing water stations that people can come to pick up water, and really bringing people together and showing that neighborly love. In a time when some folks, might otherwise be tempted to turn against each other and point fingers, and blame, right? But this is, it's really beautiful to see these practices that are affirming that water is a human right, and that it's a commons and not something that can be, kept as private property and sold for profit. That it's something that we all need for our health, our survival, and our flourishing.
There was a woman that was interviewed from Flint talking about, her children and this noticeable difference in their cognitive learning after drinking the water, and like their learning ability deteriorated. Did you hear anything about that?
Well, I've certainly heard a lot of concerns about this kind of thing, and I mean we know that lead just stays in our bodies and does do, in some cases, some pretty severe neurological damage. It can affect people for their lives and for generations too, right? I mean, lead is also, from what I understand, it can be passed forward to infants, or to fetus, I should say, during pregnancy.
Do you know
right?
why is the Flint River so polluted in the first place?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, Flint, like Detroit and so many other cities around Michigan, has been a major industrial hub for years, right? I mean, Flint was, I believe it was the first GM plant in Michigan, and also there are all kinds of chemical factories on the river, from what I understand. So, companies like DuPont and that sort of thing operating in Flint for years. And so, what would you expect when you have all these industrial organizations that deal with noxious chemicals all the time, and that deal with heavy metals, and with gasoline and so on and so forth, oil. It's just exactly what you would expect, that you'd have such a polluted river.
I mean, like that. If it wasn't acceptable to have the river be polluted in the first place,
right?
There wouldn't have been a chance of. I mean, and then for Darnell Early to switch to that river,
sure,
to save money. I mean, he didn't know that river was polluted.
Well, and what's really outrageous about all of this is that just there's all kinds of good reason to believe that they knew exactly what was going on. So, I mean, to talk about, or to mention GM again, I mean, GM knew exactly what was going on. So GM, months and months and months ago, started complaining that the water that was being taken from the Flint River was so corrosive that it was ruining their car parts, and making it right. Impossible to manufacture vehicles properly. And what happened when GM?
Not even good for cars. Wow, that's
I mean, we're talking about stuff that's eating up cars, and so, well, of course, when GM complains, the
boy.
emergency manager and the governor. Well, then that's something that we've really got to pay attention to. And we've got to get better water into the GM factory. Meanwhile, you're having the same people in power telling the residents of Flint that it's okay to drink the water. Don't worry about it. Or maybe doing the occasional boil water advisory, when big industry is seeing the water as unfit for car parts. So we've really got to ask, right? Why? I mean, why? Not only the government officials that have been involved, but we have to ask questions about what is GM's role in all of this. I mean, we're pretty obviously complicit in what's been going on. And you have a company that's been benefiting for years and making all kinds of money on the backs of the workers of Flint, and then turning around and basically staying quiet, letting this happen. Why aren't more people asking for reparations from companies like GM?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a question that needs to be asked more often.
I mean, the only thing that just keeps coming to my mind over and over again is, I mean, the people really have to step up. I mean, and just come together and demand, because I mean, clearly people in charge,
Yeah.
they're eliminating the people out of the equation. On your website, number 5 says emergency managers have no accountability. They answer only to the governor, no one else. Detroit emergency manager, right? You mentioned that guy Kevin Orr hired his own company, Jones Day, to declare the city bankrupt, and has already paid them and other consultants over $60 million. And then there's more information too, if people want to click on that. And then it goes to how will Detroit's bankruptcy led by the emergency managers affect me? So again, like, this is for basically the public in Detroit, your website and Flint.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's a resource. It's a resource definitely for folks living in Detroit, but also anyone in Michigan. I mean, like I've been saying all along, like, there are struggles here that are shared by people in a lot of different places in Michigan. Including, like I was saying before, like Flint, Pontiac, Benton Harbor, these places where emergency managers have been put into power. So in many ways, these struggles are connected, and it's really important that folks are sharing resources and sharing experiences and sharing lessons about what's going on in their particular locales. And I also wanted to come back and mention, I didn't mean at all to suggest that ordinary folks aren't responding to what's going on in Flint. I mean, there's been all kinds of fantastic grassroots organizing going on. I mean, you wouldn't have the kind of media attention that you have today in Flint if it weren't for the really dedicated work of all sorts of people who have been working literally for years trying to draw attention to this crisis that people have known is happening, right? I mean, people aren't stupid. They know when their water is brown, when it turns blue, when it stinks, when it smells like sewage, right? And when it's corroding their skin, when their hair is falling out, right? When their kids have rashes all over their body because of the hyperchlorination of the water, when they're getting sick from bacteria and all sorts of things. I mean, people have been known that this is going on for years, and they have just been repeatedly ignored. It's not that people aren't mobilizing around these sorts of things. They certainly are. It's the real question is, why is it that in a city like Flint with 100,000 residents being poisoned, why is it that it takes years and years to have any national media attention, and it's, in some ways more upsettingly, to have local media attention, right? Like, why is it that so many people in Michigan are just finding out, in the past couple of months, say, that these water crises are going on, when the people who have been living through them have known about this for years and have been trying to draw it to people's attention. So I'm thinking of people with groups like What Are You Fighting For? And the Flint Democracy Defense League. And I'd be glad to share their websites after, but I mean, these are folks who have been drawing attention to these issues, making demands on their elected officials, right? Going, in some cases, outside of the state in order to get the research help that they need to make the case for what they already know is happening, right? So contacting researchers at places like Virginia Tech, getting in touch with Erin Brockovich, bringing her to Flint. We've all heard of Erin Brockovich.
Right.
Right.
She's working on that methane gas leak in California too.
Is that right? Oh, I haven't.
She's dealing with that because she lives over there.
Right. Interesting. Wow, what a mess. But yeah, I mean, just there are a lot of really dedicated grassroots organizers who have been working on this stuff for a long time, and it's a shame, and it's just what you'd expect. But we're not hearing a lot about those people in the national, especially sort of corporate media take on all of this. When really no one would be hearing anything about this if it weren't for the dedicated work of so many ordinary folks mobilizing around this sort of thing. So
because didn't the city of Flint actually they did know about this a year ahead of when Governor Snyder said that they were aware of it, and he was already shipping in clean water a year early, then he let on that he knew about it.
Yeah, I mean we've heard about that. Yeah. That city officials in Flint were having clean water shipped in. That Governor Snyder also was anonymously delivering water filters to certain clergy in Flint, and saying, don't say that where this came from, but we're just taking precautions and that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, people in power have known. At various levels that this has been going on, and they can do all of the trying to deflect blame onto people at lower levels that they want, but we've been seeing brown water and all sorts of things like that for years, and people can't pretend that they didn't know that this was going on. I mean, it's just a total sham.
And are you aware of what's taking place at the trial?
I'm not familiar with the details. No, I'm not familiar with the details.
So I'm just going to go back to your website where it talks about Detroit's bankruptcy. Less jobs, no benefits, no unions. In Pontiac, nothing is owned by the city anymore. Everything has been outsourced to private companies, and they've laid off over 90% of the city workers.
Mm-hmm.
Increased. I mean, what's listed here, is that also what's going on in Flint? Is that how close is Flint to Detroit? I imagine it's pretty close.
Well, that's a good question, Kat. I'm not sure about the details, but I think that last point, right? I mean, I think that it's really important that people are understanding just all of the different ways in which what's going on in Flint and Detroit are connected. So there are, right, as I was saying before, shared histories of deindustrialization in these cities. There are shared histories of having state-appointed emergency managers put in, shared histories of having these very questionable water authorities created that take power away from people living in these cities. And then you have water crises in both of these cities. And all sorts of questions about what's going to happen next, right? Is there going to be in the Great Lakes state, right, the state state that is right next to roughly 20% of the world's fresh surface water, are we going to have the water infrastructure and service provision privatized here? And I mean, really, people need to understand, and people have understood in both of these places. And some folks for decades have been fighting this fight. They have understood that this is, for people in Michigan, for a lot of us, it's the fight of our lives. And it's time for people to get into this fight. There are lots of ways that can happen, but we need to make very clear at the local, state, and national level that water is a human right, that it's a public trust, and that it's a commons that cannot be privatized.
Right.
That this is, and there's legislation being advanced at the state level and at the national level right now that people can support. And at the local level, right, we need to understand. We need to be putting out as many Freedom of Information Acts, whatever it takes, to understand what's going on with these changes in the financing and the governance of our local water infrastructure and services, because we really can't let the folks who want to do what they want.
Right.
With this. And under the emergency manager law, I mean, we're seeing that it's just way too easy to do this. So it's really important too that folks are plugging in to help get this emergency manager law repealed, right? Because it's not just one person. It's not just Kevin Orr. It's not just Darnell Early, right? So long as this law is in place, then the structure is going to be in place that allows for this total lack of accountability to people living in places that need water and other basic things that we need to survive, right? But that are too easily taken away from us under emergency management.
So Flint is 66 miles north of Detroit.
That's correct. Yeah. Well, I think, here's a story that you might have heard about. I mean, you talk about whether Governor Snyder or so-and-so knew about what was going on in Flint when. I mean, just this past summer, in July, a dedicated group of activists and organizers walked those 70 hot miles all the way from the Detroit River to Flint, stopping in communities along the way, bringing people together, raising awareness, creating links, joining up struggles that people are facing across the state, and drawing attention to also what was going on in Flint. And after they marched all the way from Detroit to Flint, they went straight to Lansing. And they brought a petition that had been signed by thousands of people that they'd met along the way, right to the governor's office. And the governor or his staffers refused to accept the petition because of some technicality. But whoever's saying that they didn't know what was going on, I mean, this is just ridiculous, because when you have people, lots of them elders, right, elder organizers and activists who walk 70 miles in the hot sun in the middle of the summer, right, raising awareness about what's going on in Flint, and come straight to your office with petitions talking about just that, right? You can't say that you didn't know or that you didn't understand what was going on, because people have been telling you.
And so on your other page on your website, there's a People's Alternative Plan for Survival Toward a Sustainable Detroit. So I'm basically just, kind of assuming that you're regarding Flint under the same umbrella as Detroit, because it's whatever, like, a suburb or something, I guess, of Detroit. Is that what you would call it, Flint?
Well, not exactly, and I think that the people's alternative that you're talking about there, that was a sort of vision for of different policies and practices in Detroit that was really co-created by people who live here, and are both right resisting emergency management, as we've been saying, but also at the same time trying to create alternative governance structures that are more genuinely democratic. I shouldn't say more genuinely democratic, that are democratic at all, because the emergency managers certainly aren't. So there are lots of as I was saying, close connections between what's going on in Detroit and Flint, and increasingly there are tighter and tighter relationships that are being built by people who are dealing with these in some ways pretty closely connected water crises. And yeah, people are linking up, forging alliances, and realizing that we need to, across this state, be resisting emergency management, affirming that water is a human right, that it's a public trust and a commons, and really defending the right of everyone to have affordable, clean water. And yeah, that's it.
Okay, so I'm going to thank you, Michael Doan of Detroiters Resisting Emergency Management, and I want to, tell people to go to your website and go to the People's Plan. If you go down a bit, Part 1, People's Alternatives, the first one, financial security, it says the Michigan legislature should immediately require automatic payroll deduction and mandatory withholding for all people working in the 22 cities where there is local income tax. Detroit currently loses between 40 and 50 million in revenue per year for lack of this elementary measure. So I guess it's just like a list of the people's demands.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And they want the state to fully restore, the state must restore fully funded state revenue sharing to all cities and act as an equitable, progressive partner in a process of urban development that serves neighborhoods and human rights rather than destroying democracy and civic capital. Since 1998, due to actions of the state legislature, Detroit has lost $220 million in revenue sharing, as well as several $100 million in foregone income taxes. Direct state cuts in revenue sharing accounted for nearly 1/3 of the city's revenue losses between 2011 and 2013. So it just, it's just constant, evidence that, the people in power and running things are just completely making a mess. And just to, again, lastly refer to Tom Stevens and when he was on being interviewed last week on Democracy Now!, he called it environmental racism.
Mm-hmm.
What's going on?
Think about what's going on in Detroit and Flint. It's unimaginable that something similar would be happening in any white community around this state, right? Imagine if there were 100,000 people living in a Bloomfield Hills or a Grosse Pointe or a Royal Oak or, whatever. If there were 100,000 people who were being systematically subjected to lead poisoning, right? Not only would you have immediate outcry and constant media attention, but you would have an immediate, swift response on the part of government at all levels to deal with that crisis. And to do things like repair the infrastructure, or create new infrastructure if it's needed, and provide adequate medical care for people. You would have, and psychological support, social services. You would have reparations being paid to all of the people who have been forced to pay for what is basically poisoned water, right? You just wouldn't have people sitting on their hands and saying, "Oh, I didn't know," and it's someone else's fault and that sort of thing, right? You would have swift action that actually addresses the real problems. And among those actions would also be, I would add, repealing the emergency manager laws, without which you wouldn't have had these crises in the first place, right?
Yeah. So
yeah, I mean, Tom Stevens, I just think that this is absolutely right, that there's massive environmental racism and injustice going on in this state. Because look, I mean, what are the communities? What's the composition of the communities that are getting targeted here? I mean, they're not, right. They're predominantly Black communities, largely, struggling, in impoverished living conditions, right? And then on top of that, you have these massive public health crises connected to either, water that is literally poison, or no water at all.
Yeah, that's really daunting, extremely. But I hope you give me some updates as to how things progress over there in Flint.
Sure. And would you mind if I just plugged a couple of organizations' websites too?
Sure.
Because of course this is not just DREM. DREM is part of a much broader coalition. So in Detroit, the People's Water Board Coalition, folks should go to their website at peopleswaterboard.org. And they should also check out We the People of Detroit, which is at wethepeopleofdetroit.com. DREM, our website is d-rem.org. And another organization that's been involved in the Detroit, dealing with the water situation in Detroit for a couple of decades now is the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization. Their website is mwro.org. And in Flint, people should check out What Are You Fighting For at whatareyouffightingfor.com. And also the Flint Democracy Defense League. I don't believe that they have a website, but they do have an email address. And so if you were to look for Claire McClinton or Nayira Sharif of the Flint Democracy Defense League, these are all organizations that are doing work on the ground and in the media, and really challenging dominant narratives around the water crises in Detroit and Flint, and proposing alternatives that, as I was saying, affirm the water as a human right, a public trust, and a commons that needs to be protected. So definitely, it would be great. There's lots of work for everyone to do, to contribute in different ways. Even if it's just something like getting friends together and having a house party. There's some great films that are posted on our website, including a film by an activist filmmaker in Detroit named Kate Levy. The film's called I Do Mind Dying, Stories from Detroit About Water. Right? And she's also done some great work with a journalist who's really helped to bring the Flint water crisis to greater attention. So if you search for films called Circle of Lies, Hard to Swallow, and Corrosive Impact, those are all some good films that Kate Levy and Kurt Guyette, who works with the ACLU of Michigan, have put together. And you'll see that some of these films are, a couple of years old. There have been folks documenting what's going on for years and working with grassroots organizations to help resist what's going on and create alternatives. So definitely, it would be wonderful for your listeners to check some of this stuff out and to find ways to get involved, because there are many.
Again, thank you, Michael Doan, Doan, from Detroiters Resisting Emergency Management.
And thank you, Kat. It's really been a pleasure to talk to you and your listeners. Thanks so much.
I appreciate your time. Have a great night.
Yeah, you too. Take good care.
You too. Bye.